We'll move on to our final talk of this morning's session, which will be followed by a roundtable discussion. And our next speaker is Dr. Stephanie Holm. She's the co-director of the Western States Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit and is at the University of California at San Francisco. She'll be talking about wildfire smoke and other ambient air pollution that comes indoors and their health effects and the building characteristics that mitigate them. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the whole planning committee for having me. As Dr. Matsui just said, I'm at the University of California in San Francisco. I'm the co-director of the Western States PACU. The PACUs are Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Units. We're a network across the country of these units that provide research translation and education for folks on environmental health issues affecting pediatrics. I also work part-time at Cal EPA. So this is my standard disclosure slide to say that I work for and am funded by a lot of people, but that my work is my own and not official stances of any of the various organizations that fund or employ me. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today. So first, I'm going to discuss why you should be concerned about wildfire smoke. We'll talk a little bit about how outdoor PM comes indoors, and then we'll talk about health benefits related to interventions to decrease indoor PM, both in general and during wildfires. As Dr. McCormick just said, there's actually a lovely lead-in for me, so thank you for that. You know, evidence from these sorts of intervention studies can really provide a lot of information about the health effects and just sort of the underlying biology as well. And so we're going to lean on that a bit in this talk. All right, so first, just why you should be concerned about wildfire smoke. Wildfire events, both individual ones and combined wildfire events, can expose really large populations to smoke. So on the left is an image, October 1st of last year here in California. I think many of you know we had a number of large fires that were occurring simultaneously as a result of a cluster of lightning strikes. But you can see that this is a satellite map from NASA's Earth Observatory, and you can see that the smoke was really traveling quite a long ways. And many of you in other parts of the US saw smoke, and Canada as well, saw smoke from these wildfires even further afield. And so I think, it's just a really good reminder that even if you're not located very close to a wildfire smoke event, you can still be affected by the smoke of that event. On the right is a series of pictures that I took actually here in the Bay Area. Similar time as that satellite photo. Over a period of, I think about a week, I captured these images. These are all at around noon the same day, the same time of day over the course of about a week, as I said. And they're just a visualization of how much the visibility can change with increasing AQI value during wildfire smoke events. And I think what's most notable is that the closest wildfire smoke event to me at the time I was taking these was over a couple 100 miles away. And so, it's really an impressive amount of smoke given that distance. I always caveat this by saying that you can't always rely on visibility, right? There can be other conditions like fog and rain and all that kind of stuff that can get in the way of using visibility as an indicator. So just because you can't see smoke, if the AQI is bad, you should definitely be concerned. But the flip side is if you can see smoke, it's also a reason to be concerned. All right, so often when I talk about wildfires, I feel like there's a bit of a oh yes, we know that California, you guys have a problem sort of undertone. And so I like to show this slide. These are estimates from NOAA of the risk of very large fires in the mid-21st century compared to the end of the 20th. Just to make the point that absolutely, right, we definitely have a lot of wildfires here out west, and particularly in California, but that the risk is really increasing through a lot of the country and often in places that people don't expect. And so, yes, wildfires are a problem for us at this point, as they are for lots of areas in the country, and they will likely be a problem for even more areas in the future. So definitely something that affects a lot of the US. And certainly, these are showing areas where large fires could happen, but the entire country is within smoke plume distance of these areas. So real potential for a large population to be affected. Pardon me. So Dr. Kippen set this up really nicely earlier, that a lot of the outdoor PM really does come indoors. I like to use sort of half as my, my eyeball number that I remember in my head, both for two things. So one is that about half of outdoor PM comes indoors. That's based on really in the US data from two studies. So one's the RIOPA study, relationship of indoor, outdoor, and personal air, that measured levels in a little over 200 homes in a variety of cities. And then also the Mesa Air study, which many of you may know, that's a subset of the overall Mesa study, multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis. And that study did paired indoor-outdoor exposure in homes in the 6 centers. And so those are sort of, average estimates for homes around the US. And then the other 50% number to remember is that in terms of a person's total exposure to PM 2.5, about half of that exposure is outdoor PM that people are actually exposed to in indoor spaces, right? As Dr. Kippen pointed out, the overwhelming majority of our time, even pre-pandemic, certainly now, is spent indoors, right? And so a lot of the exposure to outdoor PM actually happens when we're in those indoor spaces. This is just a couple of recent, particularly high impact air pollution studies to make the point that many of the epidemiologic studies of air pollution use residential location as a proxy for exposure to outdoor ambient air pollution. But because folks really do spend most of their time indoors, I know me personally, if I think about the hours I spend at my home, indoors versus outdoors, right? It's overwhelmingly indoors. So when we're using residential location as a proxy for exposure, we really are talking mostly about ambient PM that is coming indoors and affecting people. There's a number of ways that people have associated that PM with folks' residential location. So the 3 examples I give here, right? There's that recent really big Medicare study, huge study, right? Looking at almost 500 million person years of follow-up that found an increase in mortality associated with PM 2.5 exposure. They were matching to residential zip codes. The Children's Health Study in Los Angeles, which has followed, thousands of adolescents over the last few decades, has demonstrated improvements in lung function growth as air pollution has decreased. And their exposure has been matched at the community level, right? And there's a recent study looking at dementia and amyloid, and they also match to residential zip code. So, just a couple examples. I sort of have this here as a placeholder to say I couldn't possibly cover the entire landscape of outdoor air pollution that comes indoors, because much of the epi that we have in general is actually that category. It's outdoor air pollution that comes indoors. So I'm going to sort of leave that as an exercise to the listener, but to just say that much of what you know already of PM 2.5 exposure really is in this bucket, right? It's outdoor PM that comes indoors. Okay, so with that background, what determines how much of the outside PM comes indoors? So there's really 3 main things that affect how much of the outside PM 2.5 comes inside. That's infiltration, mechanical ventilation, and natural ventilation. So just to define terms really quick, infiltration, you can talk about total infiltration, which could include all of these things. But in this case, I'm really specifically talking about PM 2.5 that's able to come in through the building envelope in some way or another, whether that's leaky seals around windows and doors, whether that's sort of intentional natural ventilation through the attic, right? All of those pieces. Intentional infiltration through the attic. Natural ventilation is ventilation that comes through sort of intentional opening of windows and doors. Mechanical is ventilation using an HVAC system or something like that. And sort of stepping, back one step further, in a broader sense, ventilation is exchanging air. It's funny, I've found that since the COVID pandemic has started and been going for a while, that folks are more used to this. But I used to have to spend a lot of time talking about the differences between ventilation and filtration, right? The ventilation is really exchanging air and moving air in and out of a space. That's really important for decreasing air pollutant levels from indoor sources. And then filtration is filtering of contaminants, which can be important both for decreasing pollutants from indoor and outdoor sources. One thing I noted on the slide here is that if you were to stop all three of these things, right? So infiltration through the building envelope, natural ventilation, mechanical ventilation, you'll actually have problems with pollution that's made indoors. As Dr. McCormick just mentioned, right, in homes with kids with asthma, often the indoor levels are actually much higher than the outdoor levels. So one response that I've seen, frankly, often in the setting of wildfires, people are like, well, no problem. We'll just like shrink wrap the building and no wildfire smoke will get in and it'll be fine. And the issue there is that that's not the case because we've got so much pollutant burden that's actually generated indoors. And you can also have, of course, issues with moisture and mold if you're really trying to seal a building up tightly. So a key is to really filter the air. As I said, that can help with both PM of indoor and outdoor sources. Oops, wrong way. Sorry, team. All right, so I want to speak a little bit, since I can't cover the entire breadth of the literature on health effects of outdoor PM coming inside. I figured instead what I would do is talk a little bit about how those health effects change with these different kinds of interventions and changing these different ways that outdoor PM can come inside. So the first would be tightening of the building envelope, which is decreasing that infiltration. This is sometimes also referred to as weatherization. There are very few studies that have assessed this alone, and I think that makes sense for the reason I was just describing, right? That if you really seal up a building without changing the ventilation, you can actually really run into some other issues. But there's a study that looked at a combination of weatherization and ventilation and education, or health studies, pardon me, and found that that combination can improve both asthma symptoms in adults and kids, as well as overall self-reported health. There's also, as I mentioned, studies, demonstrating just what I mentioned, that decreasing the infiltration without concomitant increases in ventilation or filtration can really actually increase indoor PM exposure. And so, it's definitely something to be worried about. And in fact, in a model of pediatric asthma, it was calculated that weatherization alone could actually increase the rate of severe asthma events. Thinking about that second piece, the improved ventilation. So if indoor PM is minimized, decreasing ventilation can actually have temporary benefits. So for example, there was a study in Taiwan where they had young adults close windows during periods of high ambient outdoor air pollution. And they actually noticed that there was at least short-term decreases in blood pressure and decreases in heart rates. Again, this gets back to that same issue, though, where it has to be a really controlled setting where the indoor sources are really minimized. In schools, improved ventilation, so increases in ventilation, have been associated with decreased absences and improvements in math and language performance. And so, it's something, this is something I often chat about with schools, that there can be real benefits to ventilation improvements, both in terms of health and in terms of learning gains. And I think that's something that's often overlooked. As I mentioned, when we're thinking about improving exposure to PM2.5 from outdoor sources, ventilation really needs to be accompanied by filtration. If there's a really bad wildfire smoke event happening and there's a lot of airflow being brought in from the outdoors, you're really going to need to filter that air in order to decrease exposures. And I know that next week there's going to be more detail on this, so I'll mention it at least a little bit briefly. But there are studies as well looking at improved filtration. In adults, improved filtration has been associated with improvements in things like subclinical cardiovascular outcomes. In general, though, there's been no changes seen in lung function related to filtration changes. There's one study that some colleagues of mine conducted in Mongolia looking at pregnancy outcomes. This was in Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital city, and that still relies on a lot of coal for power generation and for heat generation in the winter. And so it can get quite impressively polluted. And they supplied air cleaner devices in the homes of pregnant women and found that there was an increase in birth weight among term infants in the cohort. In children, filtration has been associated with decreases in asthma morbidity. And in fact, a modeling study calculated that they would expect about a 13% decrease in asthma morbidity in Detroit schools if the whole district was, if filtration was improved across the whole district. Filtration has also been associated with higher test scores. It's worth noting, though, that filtration does not increase air nicotine. So there have been studies using filtration devices in the homes of kids who also live with smokers. And often there are fewer benefits seen there than might be expected. And it's one thought is that might be because it decreases the PM burden, but doesn't actually decrease the exposure to the nicotine. Just wanted to mention, and maybe lots of folks in this audience already know this, but ion generation can really negate the benefits of filtration devices. And so it's really important to stick to mechanical filters. That can both be because some of these technologies produce ozone, which have known effects for kids with asthma, and others just produce negative ions of a variety of sorts, which can be associated with markers of inflammation and things like decreased heart rate variability. Thinking about wildfires specifically, there have been a few studies that have looked at decreases in exposure related to these kind of interventions during wildfires. So for example, there was a study of Australia where they worked on some building envelope tightening and had folks make sure to close their windows. They did see some decreases in peak levels during the smoke events. There was also a study looking at HVAC changes in Southern California homes. I always find this one really interesting to talk about because I think it makes a really good point that changing to a higher rated MERV filter, right? So the recommendation if you have an HVAC is to go to MERV 13 or higher, that changing to the filter alone without increasing the amount of airflow through it actually is not super helpful. And so their example, I've got the numbers here for you, that with an HVAC system that was continuously running with just the standard MERV filter that they had in it, they had about a 24% decrease indoors compared to outdoors for the wildfire smoke. Changing to the MERV 12, but not changing the airflow through it, there was actually less of a decrease indoors compared to outdoors. And that's probably because of a drop off in the pressure with no change in airflow. So I think it's always a good reminder to ourselves that these things really do go hand in hand. Filtration and ventilation are important together. A couple other studies have looked at filtration related to wildfire smoke events and found pretty substantial decreases using portable air cleaner devices. I did just want to mention that, total PM infiltration might actually be higher during wildfire smoke events than during ambient air pollution. That's for a couple of reasons. One is just that filters get saturated, so you can have more bypass. The other is that the composition of the PM might be slightly different. So for example, if you have more ultrafine PM, you can have less of that being captured by the filters. Really only a couple of studies that have then extended that to look at health specifically. So for example, there's a modeling study that I think one of our later presenters was involved with, where they modeled Southern California homes during a 2003 wildfire and calculated that if all of the homes had portable air cleaners and MERV 13 filters, it could have prevented more than half the respiratory admissions during the period. And then there's a great study, an older study actually from about 20 years ago out of Hoopa Valley, looking at a variety of different interventions during a wildfire smoke event. And filtration was the only one that had health benefits of the interventions that they assessed. So just really quick to wrap up, as I mentioned, I work at the Western States PACU. We have a number of infographics and fact sheets and things that we've created for the public for communicating about ways to decrease wildfire smoke exposure for kids. So this is one that we have there. You can always go to our website for others. That's it.